Buenos dias and welcome to Latina Literati. If you enjoy wonderful books, interesting ideas, and great places, then this is the channel for you. Today we are in Havana, Cuba, an amazing city, a very elegant city, a city with some deferred maintenance. It would be on par with Barcelona, Madrid, Paris. The architecture, the variety, the pleasing aesthetic of Old Havana, the very charming cobblestone streets, and the wonderful people make it just a great place to visit. And we're lucky enough to have family here, so we're here visiting for the first time in several years. We visited Old Havana, and you can see here the Plaza de Armas, and in the middle of it is a statue of Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, and on the other side is a newer statue of Eusebio Leal, a wonderful historian who dedicated his life to renovating the old part of Havana, and we lost him a few years ago, and he is irreplaceable. He really dedicated his life to retelling the history of Havana, both in his own writings as well as through the renovation and upgrading of the buildings for the tourists and for Cubans to enjoy. You can also see, we visited the Museum of Bellas Artes, and they have an exhibit called Everything Cuba Comes from the Sea. And you can see all of the different things that came in from the sea, and they've erected structures and art pieces from what has been brought in from the sea. We went to a restaurant called Carbon, and that's the only place we actually saw tourists. We saw very few. We went to a great restaurant called Divina Pastora with a beautiful view, and you can see the bay there in the city of Havana across from this restaurant, and they had a great band. So it was a wonderful afternoon with the family. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to the beginning, as we always do. Let's talk about the first peoples that lived on the Greater Antilles, the largest of the Caribbean islands. It's about 735 miles between east and west. And at the time when indigenous nations inhabited this island, the sea was lower. It was several feet lower. And so Key West was even closer. It was said that there were little islands you could hop almost all the way from Key West to Cubanacan, which was the original indigenous name. It's one of the few nations that conserves the indigenous name, or a part of it. Cubanacan becomes Cuba. So you have Christopher Columbus here in 1492, and between 1492 for the next more or less 10 years, the first inhabitants basically are done away with. And so let's talk about them. There were four indigenous groups. The Guanahatabeyes, which inhabited South Florida and Cuba. So things haven't changed. Same people that inhabit South Florida inhabited Cuba. And you also had the Ciboneys, and you had the Caribs, and you had the Taino. And so there was some intermittent disagreements and warfare between them, but all of these indigenous groups inhabited the different Caribbean islands. And so let's talk about some of the words that we use every day that have come to us from these beautiful languages. Huracan, hurricane. Canoa, canoe. Tabaco, tobacco. Barbacoa, barbecue. So these, you can just hear the resonance and the beauty of the language of the people there, even from those few words. And of course, all of those things they gave us. In other words, the concept of a canoe, the concept of tobacco, the concept of barbecue come from the Caribbean traditions and the indigenous people there. So you have Columbus in 1492, and by 1510 or so, all of the indigenous people are gone. Through disease, through murder, through terrible diseases that the Spanish bring, and also mass suicide. So this is an interesting side note that most people don't know, that several Caribbean indigenous groups decided to commit mass suicide rather than be subjugated to the horrors of the Spanish conquest. And they felt like that was doing away with the ability of the Spanish to mistreat them, right? Because you are no longer there. So horrific war. And it's really, this has been a theme throughout our videos. This entire hemisphere is established and drenched in the blood of our indigenous ancestors, as well as our African ancestors. And so Cuba is the first place to receive enslaved peoples from Africa in this hemisphere. Cuba will be the forefront of the next 50 years of conquest of this entire hemisphere and of the murder that occurs of indigenous people throughout the hemisphere by the Spanish. So you have about 13 million enslaved people that over the next 350 years will be brought to Cuba, and about 2 million will never make it. So again, many will throw themselves off boats because they don't want to live the reality that they've been subjected to. Many will die of disease in their filth, and it's a horrific historical moment where you have enslaved people being brought to Cuba because there are no indigenous people left. And the Spanish want to build roads and have farms and exploit the natural resources. And the only way to do that is, in their mind, is by bringing people to be exploited in Cuba. So as Cuba continues to develop, remember, as the Spanish conquer different countries, Mexico, Central America, South America, they begin to plunder and bring back precious metals, especially gold. And with the rise of these ships bringing gold back to Spain, of course, you have a rise in piracy, especially the famous British pirates that the Queen of England charters as special privateer kind of pirates that says, okay, you can plunder, but you have to give the crown a part of it too. So in order to protect these treasure ships, a treasure fleet would gather in Havana and await ships from different parts of Mexico, Central America, and South America, and then travel together back to Spain. And some of them were lost, so there are still ships out there filled with the gold stolen from the Americas. But that was a way to ensure their safety. So coming back to Cuba, that means that for months, people with gold were there, and it made it a very rich place, a place that was developed along the lines of the Spanish capitals. And that's why the architecture is so similar. You can literally close your eyes and think that you're in residential areas of Madrid, as I said, or Barcelona, and even Paris. So it's just a very beautiful city, and it needs a lot of deferred maintenance, but it's a very architecturally significant and important city. And so that brings me to the kind of the next chapter in the journey of Cuba as a nation. You can imagine you have a population that is mostly enslaved people. You have a tiny little bit of indigenous people that have mixed into the enslaved people, and then you have the Europeans, and of course you have children of all of those groups. So you have a situation that eventually bubbles up, because as each generation is born, they're treated worse by the Spanish, and the people that are born in Cuba are called criollos. So you have a situation where there's just more and more laws being promulgated in Spain to extract resources from Cuba, and the Cubans are chafing under these laws. And so in 1865, you have the beginning of the rebellion. And so at this, I want to tell you about a woman who is known as the mother of the Cuban nation. Her name was Mariana Grijalva, and she is the mother of 14, what they call the family of heroes. One of her sons is called the Bronze Titan, and he's considered the father of the Cuban nation. But let's focus on Mariana. Mariana was a mulata, and she married two men. The first one passed away, and then the second one, Maceo. And so as they realized that the only way to liberate themselves is to lift up arms, it is said that she, her husband, and her children get on their knees and say, we will fight for our country or we will die for her. And so she would lose, of her 14 children, she would lose 10 to the war against Spain, because you have very bloody battles one after the other. And she, in fact, is taken to Kingston, Jamaica for her own safety and dies there in the early 1900s. Is eventually brought back to Santiago, and that's where her remains are. Incredibly, that is where Fidel asks that his remains be put in the same urn with the mother of the nation. So I was completely surprised to learn that during this trip. But in any case, Mariana said again and again that the greatest gift she could give Cuba was the sacrifice of her children in the fight for freedom. The intellectual author of the Cuban Revolution against Spain is Jose Marti, and he actually visits Mariana in Kingston and is very moved by her kindness and her position that Cuba must be free of Spain. So Jose Marti is a very well-known poet, a very well-known author, and if you've ever heard the famous Cuban song, Guantanamera, Guajira, Guantanamera, well, that's his poem. And in fact, the last US president to visit Cuba began his speech with Jose Marti phrase that I offer a white rose in the name of friendship. And of course, the Cuban people went crazy because they immediately recognized that. So whoever that speechwriter was, they hit it. And so Jose Marti, although he's the intellectual author, and in fact, he spent a lot of time in New York, he spent a lot of time in Mexico and in Guatemala. In fact, it is said that the president's daughter of Guatemala fell in love with him, and she was only 15, and he went back to marry his fiancée in Mexico, and she passed away. And so he wrote a very famous poem called La Niña de Guatemala, and it says, they say she died of a cold, but I know she died of love. So very romantic poetry, and his works are really beautiful, but I'll recommend those later. I want to talk about Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, Mariana's son, and he's known as the Bronze Titan of Cuba. He is the father of the Cuban nation, and there are statues to him throughout Cuba. It's interesting to note that it's the western part, Santiago, Bayamo, where you have these uprisings. And so that part of Cuba is known as the cradle of revolution, because that's where the uprisings have been throughout the history of Cuba. I want to tell you about an indigenous leader who personifies the attitude of the indigenous in Cuba. His name was Arte, and in fact, one of the Cuban national beers is called Arte in his honor. And he kept the Spanish locked in their fort with forces for a long time. Eventually, they received reinforcements. They went after the Arte and his men. They caught him and burned him at the stake as punishment. Before he died at the stake, he was asked to convert so that then he would go to heaven. And he famously responded, "Are there Spaniards in heaven?" And of course, the priest there said, "Of course there are." Then he says, "I have no wish to join them." So it's a very famous line, and there are murals and paintings of Arte basically not wanting to have anything to do with the Spanish in this world or in the next. So we get to the Cuban Revolution against Spain, and it was a very, very bloody revolution. Hundreds of thousands of people are killed on both sides. And one of the most moving things that I've seen in Santiago on the famous San Juan Hill is a monument to the Spanish soldiers that died in Spain. Because you have to remember that many of the people fighting on both sides were just a generation away from Spain. So you had really the children of Spaniards fighting on both sides. And so that monument is just very moving to think that a country would recognize the sacrifice of another country in its war against it. I just thought that was just so filled with humanity. So I think I want to leave this here because I feel like the last 150 years deserve their own video. But now we get to my favorite part, the book recommendations. And I'm going to just 3 books that I think encapsulate encapsulate this colonial part of the history of Cuba for you to delve more into this time in Cuban history. First, Cecilia Valdez. I have found it on PDF, and so I'm going to leave you the link so you can read it. This is the classic, iconic colonial romance novel, and I'm not going to give away the ending, but it's a love story, but it also is an insight into the life in colonial Cuba. Also a history of Carlos Manuel de Céspedes. There's a book about his life and his writings. Finally, as I've mentioned, the national poet Jose Marti, a collection of his works, because his poetry is very beautiful. And again, if you've listened to Cuban music, I'm sure that you've heard more than one of his verses that have been put to music. So thank you so much for joining us on this journey, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I'd love to hear from you, what you'd like us to talk about in the future. Please leave your comments. And in celebration of our 1-year anniversary, we have launched our podcast. And so I'll leave the link below so that we delve in more in depth into Cuba, and we actually speak to someone from Cuba and discuss different things that are going on there. So please join us. Thank you so much again. And as always, we wish you mucho cariño, mucha salud y mucho amor. Muchas gracias.